Welcome to the Western Baul podcast series, with talks on traditional spiritual teaching and its application in the world today. The intention of the series is to offer something useful for those who are drawn to study themselves and engage practice on the spiritual path. New talks are posted twice each month. The content of the talks is for informational purposes only, and not to provide any kind of counseling, medical, or professional advice. This podcast is titled, Keep My Heart Open in Hell. The talk was given by Nachama Greenwald on July 6, 2024 via Zoom. Nachama is a physical therapist, editor, and musician who for 17 years was a member of the Shri blues band, which performed Western Baul music. In this talk, she says that there is a deep desire in each of us to have our hearts awakened in love, and that being in hell, when we experience the most difficult and painful aspects of life and of ourselves, has the potential to be transformative. She refers to inspiring examples of people who have been able to keep their hearts open in hell, including the poet Jimmy Santiago Baca. Nachama discusses teachings of the Zen master Maezumi Roshi, the French master Arnaud Desjardins, and her own teacher Lee Lozowick. She speaks about paying attention to our simple interactions as a way we can work with keeping our hearts open. If there is benefit in this talk for you, please consider sharing the link to it or writing a review on social media or on one of the podcast platforms. Nachama Greenwald.
So first of all, I want to welcome everybody. Thank you for coming and being willing to participate with your engaged presence and your comments. The title of this talk is Keep My Heart Open in Hell. And just a couple of things in the beginning. I read this morning that today is the Dalai Lama's birthday. It's his 89th birthday. And it struck me as an auspicious day to give a talk on the Dharma. So I thought I'd mention that tens of thousands of people are celebrating his birthday. And just as I've done in previous talks, I want to acknowledge the Yavapai, Havasupai, and Hualapai tribes whose land we are living on here in this area in Arizona and who are the original and true stewards of this land. Okay, so I would like to begin by reading a prayer. This is written by Mirabai Starr, who's a writer and speaker and who I had the good fortune to meet and interview a number of years ago, and it's called Prayer to the Shekhinah. And Shekhinah is a Hebrew word for the sacred feminine, the divine feminine. She's everything that is incarnated and embodied. So by reading this prayer, we are invoking her. We are calling on her to be with us here tonight and to be with the whole world. And we humbly ask her to pour her mercy and compassion on us, to protect and comfort us. I thought it would be a good way to set the mood for the evening. So this is from Mirabai's book, Wild Mercy. O Shekhinah, yours is the feminine face of the holy, the luminous moon who lights up the night as we travel from captivity to liberation, the pillar of fire who guides our way home, the cloud hovering over the mountain peaks, living sign that the drought is over. You are the indwelling presence of the divine. Whenever we gather to praise the one, you are here in our midst. When we cry out for justice, you make our hearts tender. When we stand with those on the margins, you make our legs strong. When we create works of art and parent our children and harvest our gardens, you guide and sustain us. You are the Sabbath queen, the great mother who sits at the heart of the table, tearing off hunks of the secret bread that contains the exact flavor each of us loves best. You feed us all, the proud and the repentant, the believer and the skeptic, from your own hands. Your unconditional forgiveness dissolves otherness. O Shekhinah, we are the vessel for your inflowing. Your radiance requires the clay of our embodiment. Your flame burns at the core of the earth. Your warmth penetrates the seedbed and animates the seedlings. You bless the head of every animal and kiss the tear-streaked face of humanity. You are the vision that builds community, and you are our refuge when the fabric of community unravels. Be with us now as we navigate this landscape of mystery, where your most cherished attributes, wild mercy and boundless compassion, righteousness and wisdom, seem to be cast aside and trampled by imperious world powers, and we are paralyzed by helplessness. Help us. May we remember you and lift you up. May we recognize your face and celebrate your beauty in everything and everyone, everywhere, always. The idea for this talk came out of the devastation I feel for the ongoing and dire situation in Gaza. I had received an email which said, "Our willingness to feel the pain of the world is inextricably entwined with our capacity to love." And I believe that to be true, that our willingness to feel sorrow, to feel grief, and our suffering, and all suffering, is directly related to our capacity to love, to feel awe and wonder and beauty. Thus the title for this talk. So the question is, what is the value of keeping our hearts open in hell? And for the rest of the talk, we're going to be circumambulating this question from different angles. Why would we want to do something that could easily be perceived as just unpleasant and something that triggers our survival mechanism, our survival instinct that makes us want to do the opposite, to close down, to shut down, because we feel that we have to protect ourselves? But tonight, we're going to consider this question from the spiritual perspective. As spiritual practitioners, what is the value of keeping our hearts open when it's most painful and difficult? Here's another quote from Mirabai Starr. This is from the same book as the prayer. She writes, "It is the task of the divine feminine to awaken us to what is real and to who we are. And it is my feeling that who we are and what is real in this world is love, that there's a deep desire in each of us to have our hearts ignited and awakened to love. And in surrendering to that desire, we allow love to initiate us and transform us. And there are many ways in which love does that, but a powerful way is when we are in hell, because hell pulls us under the surface of life, where we live with our routines, our schedules, our predictability, our comfort zones, and it pulls us under all of that, and it shakes us up, it breaks us open, and sometimes it unravels us. And so we can say that, in a sense, there's a way in which we come alive when we're in hell because we're broken open. Our senses are heightened. We're more awake. We're destabilized. And we're thrust out of our self-absorbed state. In that state, when we're thrust out of it, we tend to become more interested in and attuned to the suffering of others. I heard this quote recently from the French writer Albert Camus, who said, "Live to the point of tears." In other words, we want to go through our lives awake, aware, alive, feeling deeply, feeling the ways in which we are connected to our true selves and to the world. So hell is a rich opportunity for practice. It's where we come alive because our suffering wakes us up and gets our attention. And we're aware that something is pushing on us. And when we choose to keep our hearts open there as practitioners, we choose the road that stretches us, that forges our being, that grows and develops our soul. And we choose to awaken to love rather than being comfortable and safe. So we choose to grow and to be aware and to be conscious. And what becomes available to us in hell is transformation, because we can transform our suffering, our pain, into beauty, into love, into creativity. And there's so many examples of that we can think of, well-known artists and musicians and poets, as well as people that are completely unknown that are working with this transformational possibility. It's like Rumi said, the wound is where the light enters. And I think about the poet Mary Oliver, who had a childhood of a lot of parental neglect and sexual abuse. And she used to go out into the woods by her house and spend hours in nature. And nature was her sanctuary. And look at what she gave to the world. Look at this exquisite poetry about nature, about wonder, about beauty, all of that. So there is tremendous transformational possibility when we are in the realm of what we would call hell. And I want to emphasize what I feel is an important point, which applies to everything that I want to say tonight. In keeping our hearts open in hell, it's not about an ongoing state of misery and gloom. We're not walking around with the cloud of gloom over our heads. We're not moping around. It's actually the opposite of that. In our openness to reality as it is, to saying yes to what is, that we actually find joy, delight, beauty, inspiration, and awe. And we have gratitude and appreciation for the ways in which we are able to find enjoyment in this life. Joseph Campbell understood this, and he talked about joyful participation in a world of sorrow. He said, "We cannot cure the world of sorrows, but we can choose to live in joy." My teacher, Lee, had a song that he wrote the lyrics to for one of his bands called Death by Music. And there's a line in the song which goes, "Satisfied with the joy and the cracks between my sorrows." And I find that to be such a evocative, poetic line. It's like he's saying, yes, there's a lot of sorrow in life, but it's enough to find joy in the cracks. It's like those moments of grace. I think about this image of when there's a sky that's full of clouds and the sun comes out from behind the clouds and just drenches the world with light. So when we keep our hearts open, although there are times when the cracks of heartbreak and sorrow seem as wide and deep as the deepest chasm, we are still able to choose joy and delight and beauty in our lives because we are large enough in our being to hold all of it. Here's how Ram Dass answered the question. This is great. This is from many years ago, but it still applies in the present time. Ram Dass says, there's a tendency in us to find suffering aversive, and so we want to distance ourselves from it. If there are suffering people, you want to look at them on television or meet them, but then keep a distance from them because you are afraid you will drown in a pain that will be unbearable. And the fact of the matter is, you have to, because if you close your heart down to anything in the universe, it's got you. And you are then at the mercy of the suffering. If you are going to be free, your freedom means that you do not avert your eyes from anything in yourself or in anyone else. Freedom means to be a free awareness with what is. They say that for a saint, all the world are their children, and you feel the suffering of another person the same way you would as if it was your own child. It's almost unbearable. What makes it unbearable? There's a little statue of the Buddha, and it has a smile at the edge of its mouth. It's called the smile of unbearable compassion. Sounds like a paradox. It is beyond bearing, and if you were somebody, you couldn't bear it. But you are the universe. That is what you are. You are all of that, and it is that balance inside yourself. It is the ability to embrace that suffering into yourself, to keep taking it in and look towards it instead of away from it. You have to look at what is and say yes. And that involves bearing the unbearable. In a way, who you think you are can't do it, but who you really are can do it. So you learn to keep your heart open in hell. I didn't get the title from this quote, but he says that too. So my sense about what he's saying is that who we actually are is much more than who we think we are, because who we think we are is based on our personal individual identity, our personal identifications, our cultural and religious conditioning, our biases, our preferences and opinions. And that self cannot do it. But who we actually are is so much more than that. It's beyond the realm of duality and separation. And it's in that unitive state where we have an interdependent relationship with all that is. So it joins us with the entirety of creation. So in a sense, we're not holding anything by ourselves as a separate identity, but rather as an integral and interdependent part of creation. So when we embrace the recognition of our true state, when we embrace the vastness of who we really are, we are able to keep our hearts open. So Ram Dass is challenging our conceptions of ourselves as limited and small. And he's asking us to stand in a much larger, vaster, unitive world where we can look at what is and say yes. And so I think he's asking us to stand in big shoes, spiritually speaking. And as I was thinking about this quote and what he was saying, I was reminded of something that I also feel is important to mention tonight, which is that we really don't want to lose our sense of humor. We want to have a sense of humor, and we want to be able to laugh wholeheartedly. It's not like we're taking a break. Okay, I'm going to laugh. I'm going to think of something funny. It's not a break from what Ram Dass is talking about. It's actually, I think, part of the practice to have a kind of levity and lightheartedness as we dance through all of this. So important to have a sense of humor, all of us, and especially in these times that we're living through as well. I have to be reminded of that. I'm speaking to myself when I say this here. So I would like to talk about tonight two individuals that I feel are inspiring, brilliant examples of people who have been able to keep their hearts open in hell. And first one I want to speak about now, and then towards the end of the talk, the second. So the first person that I'd like to speak about that has been deeply inspiring to me is Jimmy Santiago Baca. Do people know who he is? Has anybody heard of him? Okay. All right. So it's worth talking about some of the details of his life. He's a poet. His lineage is Chicano and Apache. And he's actually an award-winning poet and writer. He's written many, many, many books of poetry. And I listened to a talk that he did back in February. I was attending an online haiku poetry workshop, and he was one of the featured speakers. And when the Roshi introduced him, she described him as a bodhisattva that woke up within the walls of hell. And she said, bodhisattvas do not seek easy situations. So you'll understand when I tell his story. So Jimmy was abandoned by his parents at the age of 2. And I believe his father murdered his mother, and his father died of alcoholism. And he was placed in an orphanage. But at the age of 13, he ran away and went to live on the streets. Pretty dangerous, edgy life, dealing drugs. And when he was 21, he was sent to prison on charges of drug possession. And he was incarcerated for about 5 years. Most of the time that he was in prison, he spent in solitary. And solitary in that prison, you actually had to descend several floors to where the solitary confinement area was. So it was in this deep, dark dungeon. There was very little light, very, very dangerous criminals. And he was in this tiny, tiny little cell. And he stayed there for most of the time. All he wanted, and what he kept asking the prison warden was, he wanted an education. He was illiterate. He could not read or write. And he wanted to learn how to read or write. And they kept promising that he could have that, but they never delivered on their promise. And instead, they wanted him to work. And he said no. So he was in solitary all the time. And he began to have these profound spiritual experiences when he was down in that dungeon, in that tiny little cell, of Kundalini awakening. He was seeing images of disembodied gurus, and he didn't even know what a guru was, but he was seeing all these images of gurus that were not in a form anymore. And he was levitating and astral traveling and seeing waves of light. He didn't understand what was happening for him, but it was very strong phenomenon. And a man who I believe was a minister began to correspond with him and asked him, is there anything that you need? And Jimmy said, I just want a dictionary. So the man sent him a dictionary, and he would spend hours just trying to read the dictionary, figure out how to pronounce the words. And he taught himself little by little how to read and write. And eventually, as his skills improved, get books smuggled into the prison, books of classic literature and poetry. And he began writing poems for the inmates. And he tells a story about this white man who was in prison with him. And on one side of his neck, he had tattooed, kill blacks. And on the other side, he had kill Mexicans. And this guy wanted a letter written to his mother because he was illiterate too. So Jimmy said, yes, I'll write a letter for you to your mother. He wrote the letter. He read it to this guy who was in his prison cell. And Jimmy said he could see that the guy was gripping the prison bars so tightly that his knuckles were turning white. He was furious. He was so angry. And so Jimmy backed away and said, I'm not going to finish reading this letter. You're going to kill me. And the man said, no, please finish the letter. And when he was done reading the letter, the man looked at him and said, how does a Mexican know what's in a white man's heart? And that man, who hated Mexicans and wanted to kill them, became his friend. And Jimmy realized that there was great power in language and being able to read people and feel into their hearts and to use words to communicate what he saw and felt. So it was like he discovered his superpower. And eventually he got out of prison and he went on to write books of poetry, but he didn't kick back and lead a comfortable life, just relaxing. He stayed very, very close to the streets in a way. And he taught literacy workshops and poetry workshops to prisoners, to ex-cons, to young kids in juvenile detention on reservations, to prostitutes. And he acquired some land and he built a retreat house for ex-cons to come and write their memoirs. He provided a place for them free of charge, and he took care of them and he took care of their families. And he's spoken at these elite universities like Harvard and Stanford. So he's interfaced with people from all walks of life. And he himself was shot several times. And one of his brothers was murdered. So this was his life. And he said this when I listened to his talk in February, and I loved it so much that I want to share it with you. So he said, I have to make use of what I do in this life to serve others. I don't know how to do this except through my work. I came out of this matrix of madness and I came out dancing. If you follow my blood steps, they lead to heaven all the way. To be able to touch a word and have it light up, I don't know where it's from, but it's lit my dark path in this world. I come from the warring grounds, from the wasteland, and I'm so happy. I work with all these people, from Harvard elites to young prostitutes, and I can't help stumble upon joy. I approach everything with joy. So not only did he wake up and transform in hell, but after this transformation and awakening in the most toxic and abusive environment of prison, he stayed close to the streets. He works with marginalized groups, with those who have been mistreated by the system, young adults in juvenile detention, on reservations. So he is serving through what he loves, which is language and words. So you can understand why the Roshi introduced him as a bodhisattva, completely dedicated to the service of others. And he came alive in hell. He woke up to his true nature in that dungeon with no light, that smelled terrible, with really intensely dangerous criminals, all of that. And he said that he wakes up every morning with joy. In Fleet Mall, he's a Buddhist, he's a student of Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche. He said about Jimmy Santiago Baca, he said, when the fires in hell are hotter, the transformation is deeper. Jimmy Santiago Baca wrote a memoir about his time in prison called The Place to Stand. And I read it years ago. It made such a strong impact on me. I cannot recommend it highly enough. It's a very, very powerful book. It's called The Place to Stand. Okay, I want to talk about a couple of other things and then open it up to your comments. So a few months ago, I read an article in a Buddhist magazine called Why Should I Appreciate Life? By a man named Dale S. Wright, who I was not familiar with. And in the article, he's wrestling with himself, his disappointments, his failures, his regrets, his weaknesses, his dishonesty, the kinds of things that when we allow ourselves to see them, they make us squirm. So the question is, how do we stay open when we are suffering with the hell of ourselves? And how do we stay open to that with compassion and honesty and without judgment? How do we stay open when we're looking at those aspects of ourselves that we're not so proud of? So the author, he wants to understand more about this and get some perspective. So he looks to two of his spiritual mentors, the Zen teacher Maezumi Roshi and the German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche. And both of these individuals, he said, suffered greatly in their lives, intense suffering for most of their lives. And he felt that they would have something to offer him about his suffering. And he quotes Nietzsche, who wrote, "My formula for greatness in a human being is amor fati, not just to bear the given, the necessary, still less to conceal it, but to love it." The author then asks, is that feasible? To love and appreciate my injuries and sicknesses, my humiliating weaknesses, my dishonesty, greed, and egocentricity, and the numerous acts of cowardice by which I have hidden all this from everyone? Even if this demand were intellectually plausible, it would still strike me as viscerally unpalatable. So he doesn't like those parts of himself. Maybe he's repulsed by them. Can you relate to this? I know that I can. And then he goes on. He says, because we are finite beings, pain, failure, and depression are inevitably woven into the very fabric of our lives. To accept that basic fact is to finally come to terms with what it means to be human. This fundamental self-acceptance is the basis of self-respect, and self-respect is the seed and substance of an awakened life. My task is to embrace the whole of my life without denial or revulsion. Maezumi Roshi said that the capacity to tolerate the truth about oneself and the world, to set aside self-placating delusions and face the way things really are, is absolutely essential to the awakening of freedom in life. Maezumi Roshi said, love the truth, whatever that is, because the truth will set you free. I think that's also from other spiritual traditions as well. But it's a powerful statement. Love the truth, whatever that is, because the truth will set you free. So not only do we come to accept all that happens in our lives, we come to love it. And we are willing to face all the ways in which we want to deceive ourselves, deny the truth, the ways in which we want to cling to our delusions because we love the truth more. And this is something that I feel we want to aspire to as spiritual practitioners, to love the truth more than our delusions. And to love the truth is to love reality. It's to love reality as both heaven and hell. So the author then wonders, well, that sounds good, but how do we go about this? Where do we start? How do we go from accepting what is to loving what is? And in answer to his question, he comes back to Nietzsche, who suggests that first, one must just learn how to love, and that love needs to be cultivated. And Nietzsche uses the example of music. He says that we learn to love music by listening to it repeatedly over stretches of time. We become intimately familiar with it until the music becomes part of us. And this, he says, is how we learn to love everything. We become intimately familiar with it. We come back to it again and again and again, so that gradually a space opens within us for that love to reside, which includes love and appreciation for ourselves. So there's a question here that we can ask. There's a question that came up for me, which is, what's the difference between accepting all that we are and loving all that we are? Is there a state beyond acceptance that we could call love? So I thought about this. And my sense is that to go from acceptance to love is a higher state that is more about surrender. That through seeing the truth of ourselves, we actually become humbled. Some of our arrogance is worn down. And we recognize that we are not that different from each other in what we struggle with. And so we surrender to our humanity. We surrender to our human condition with compassion. And there's a kind of grace in that. So we love the truth because it's real. And what's real is holy in this life. And that's what Mizumi Roshi called awakening to freedom in life, that the truth sets us free. So we wish to be free from the confines of our false self, what is not authentic, what is not true about ourselves, and to awaken to what is real in ourselves and in life. This is freedom. And we can't do that without loving the truth. And loving the truth more than our delusions is a state of a mature adult, not a child. So we embrace the whole of our lives without denial and revulsion by learning how to love everything, including ourselves. Like the way Nietzsche says, we learn to love music, listening to it repeatedly over stretches of time until it becomes a part of us. And we do the same with our lives through practice and through what the French teacher Arnaud Desjardins calls loving what we don't love. And I want to read a short quote from Arnaud that addresses that. What does it mean to love what we don't love? So Arnaud says, we are surrounded by people who are angry with us, people who are harmful to us. One may feel persecuted by one's brother-in-law, one's neighbor, or even one's mate. We then come back to a basic assumption that there's a division of existence into two sides, friendly and unfriendly. We assign a smile to the friendly side, indicating assurance and gratification. But if the battery is dead and our alarm clock does not ring when we had to be awakened, existence then becomes, frankly, unfriendly. One common denominator in every spiritual teaching is that of renouncing the right we gave ourselves not to love what we don't love. The state of love implies love for all those we don't love. It's not that we are going to especially love who does not seem lovable or someone we have a tendency to criticize, but we have love for our enemies because we are settled in love. And he defines an enemy as anything that represents the unfriendly side of existence at any moment. So we learn to have love for what we don't love because we are settled in love. That's the key point. And he describes this being settled in love as being in a state of unconditional benevolence. And it has nothing to do with the external environment. It doesn't have anything to do with other people, with anyone who has hurt us, wronged us, disappointed us. It doesn't fluctuate with circumstances and individuals. It's something that is immovable and unchanging within ourselves. So, in a sense, we are able to walk through hell with an open heart because we have love for what we do not love. And this is not a psychologically driven state. It's not about being nice or being adaptive or people-pleasing. It's something that is forged from our being and from our practice. So we are able to keep our hearts open in hell because we are grounded. We have forged something that is stable and strong within ourselves that carries us through all of it. This being settled in love and having love for what we don't love. Okay, I'd like to ask if anybody wants to comment, anybody has an idea about what it means to them, what the value of keeping one's heart open in hell. Would anybody like to make a comment about that or anything else?
Yeah, so what you're talking about is an extremely high level of understanding and practice and intention. So sure, I would like to keep my heart open in hell. I would like to love everyone. I would like to love my enemies. My question is, where do I start? I mean, I can't just jump there from ground zero into that. It's a very, very big leap. The first thing that occurs to me is I have to first see all the ways that I'm not wanting to accept this politician, this current situation, this current war, and finding the anger, the hatred, whatever is building up in me. I mean, starting there to see where I'm not being that. So that's my first impression about this practice, which I totally honor.
Yeah, that's the whole thing. It's a very high practice, but what I find for myself that's helpful is sometimes to talk about practices like this that are higher practices because it's where my heart wants to go. I find that what works best, what's most optimal for me is to pay attention to the simplest of daily interactions, pay attention to my mind. And what I notice is that I am not in a place where my heart is open many times. I'm actually in a place where I'm angry or I'm frustrated by an ongoing stupid war or whatever it is, or I'm angry at something that someone said to me. So the only thing that I can say is that what helps me is to remember the tenderness that I feel sometimes. I have moments where I feel so much tenderness towards everything. We planted a tree a few months ago in our front yard, and the tree is blooming. It's a crepe myrtle tree, and it's blooming these gorgeous, bright pink flowers right now. And I felt so much joy. I was so excited about it and just happy that the tree lived in the desert, just happy about that. And so to make use of that moment as a moment of remembrance, because it's impossible. It's like delusions are endless. I vow to end them all, or all of these Buddhist vows are impossible. These practices sometimes feel impossible to me, but I just try and stay close to my heart. And I notice when I'm shut down, when I'm in fight or flight, when my nervous system is dysregulated and I can't access anything, I'm not open to anything. I notice those moments. It doesn't mean that I'm always free of judgment. I get frustrated with myself about it. And sometimes I think I should be able to do things that I don't do. But all I can say is whatever moments do arise, to use those as moments of remembrance and to always, for me, like I said, to be able to access the tenderness in life. I just know that simple things can put me in touch with how much I love everything sometimes. The love that I have for the world or the love that I have for humanity. It can be a leaf falling from a tree. It could be the hummingbirds coming to my hummingbird feeder and putting their beaks in the nectar and tasting some of that and then flying away with their little families. So that's what comes to mind. Would you like to respond to that?
what I'm left with is that remembrance that as we enter into health, that we don't forget to cultivate the appreciation of beauty all the way down and all the way up again.
Yeah, because there's always beauty, whether we see it or not. There's a great possibility of transformation in this, and we don't have to effort and try so hard. It's just something that if we have our eyes and our hearts open, it becomes available to us.
You were talking about going from acceptance to love. That's much more challenging for me if I'm interacting with someone who I see as harmful or who has done harm to me or someone else. But where I often can go are some steps before that, before love. I can usually be friendly, even with someone I don't care for. I can treat someone kindly. I just choose to. If I'm with them, I kind of disregard their behaviors and their attitudes, and I can treat them kindly. And it's easier for me also to go into a state of compassion for the person because I know, wow, if they're hurtful to me or other people, they are really hurting inside. And I'm just really aware of that. So sometimes I can go into compassion. That's just easier for me than going to love. That's just a big step for me. Or just be present rather than to think about who they are or what they're doing or their attitude or whatever. Just be present to the moment. And all of that helps me. I can also wish them well internally.
Mm-hmm.
I love the Buddhist metta practice. May you be happy. May you be healthy. May you be at ease. I can go there, and that really helps. All of those things where I can go, a lot of the time, those things help my heart stay open. So that's what I wanted to say. We were distracted a little bit because there's a bear running through our neighborhood.
Oh,
I thought you were going to say it was running through your house.
No. just through the backyards.
I want to address what you said because I think it's easy to misinterpret Arnaud Desjardins, the quote that I read about loving what we don't love, because we think we have to just go around loving everybody. And I don't think that's what it is at all, because there are people that are harmful. We want to be able to make the right kinds of distinctions. So I don't necessarily feel that I'm going to be overflowing with compassion for every single person, even those specifically that have been very hurtful, those that have done something that crossed a boundary. We have to be smart about it. And so for me, it's more helpful to see it as just a principle, but we always want to relate to each individual circumstance. So sometimes loving what we don't love is about being really fierce. Sometimes loving what we don't love is about being angry, righteously angry, Vajra kind of anger. It's not like it becomes limited to this spectrum of just one emotion or one state. It includes all states. It includes all states. But there's a foundation of a kind of benevolence. We could call it goodwill. Maybe Arnaud wouldn't call it that, but perhaps we can call it goodwill in general. And then we deal with circumstances as we need to deal with them. You know, what Gurdjieff used to call idiot compassion. We don't just want to be blindly compassionate and wishing everybody well all the time, no matter what they do and no matter how many lines they cross. We're talking about something that has a lot of refinements and a lot of distinctions. But it doesn't mean that we're nice and kind to everybody, no matter what the individual circumstance is.
And this distinction, for me, it's very helpful when I remember I can open my heart to the being of the person who's just annoying me, but I do not have to approve or like their actions. So if I make a distinction between the being and the doing, that helps me a lot. Yeah, because I think everybody was a little baby, and I often said, what did they do to this little baby that it ended up as a Hitler or ended up as a murderer? Or something happened to them, to this innocent baby, to this being. What I understand, idiot compassion, to say, okay, you're yelling at me. That's wonderful. Yell another half hour. I'm here. I'm your garbage can. So it's like, no, that is stupid. And that is not helping the person. And that is not helping me. That is abuse.
Mm-hmm.
So this distinction helps me a lot. Open my heart to the being, and I don't have to approve his actions.
I like this idea of remembering that we start out with what Lee calls organic innocence, that we all have that. And just to remember that innocence can be really useful. And we don't want to be doormats. It's not about being a victim in any way, shape, or form at all. It's about being a warrior. And warriors experience all range of emotions, feelings, and all of that. So we have to keep that in mind when we're trying to understand a higher principle, such as what Arnaud is talking about, or Mizumi Roshi is talking about, loving the truth. That's also a high principle as well. It's a high practice.
When I'm looking at my reactiveness to something, it's helpful for me to make an assumption, especially if I'm angry, that I'm feeling hurt. Mm-hmm. There's a vulnerability that I'm experiencing. And some of that might be a story that I'm telling myself. So I have to really attend to my internal dialogue. And it's easier for me if I'm feeling hurt to have some compassion for myself. And then that's the platform from which I start interacting with the other person. And it doesn't mean not necessarily protecting myself from abusive behavior or something like that, but starting with myself and looking at my internal dialogue and my internal pain. If I'm not on the firing line as a target, if I feel I'm on the target, I have to have a boundary. But when I'm not being the target, I really have to look at my own processing. And that helps me to get in more of a place of equanimity and compassion. What's my part of it?
Yeah. It's not cut and dry. It's not formulaic. It's not black and white. It's very, very nuanced.
Well, I had just been sharing recently something from Arnaud's ever-present piece about loving even in the face of people's abhorrent behavior. And I wanted to share a little bit of that, if that's okay.
That'd be great.
Okay. So this is from Ever-Present Peace by Arnaud Desjardins. I will ask you a question that has to do with cruelly traumatizing human behavior to others, to children, that of pedophilias. Do you love pedophiliacs? Your answer is probably, of course not. But you're wrong. One has to be able to feel the same love for torturers as for victims. I do not say that loving means approving, and I do insist on this distinction, which is what you were saying, Nachama. This is a truth that is at once one of the most clearly affirmed by all spiritual teachings and one of the most difficult to listen to. To many people, the idea of having love for torturers, for monsters, is unbearable, and yet it cannot be otherwise. Being settled in bliss means being settled in love, and being settled in love means being settled in bliss. And he goes on to talk about how it's a state of being, not a judgment or non-judgment. But perfect love is still beyond this kind of non-selfishness and generosity. It is an inner stable condition. With self-observation and without immediately judging yourself, you will begin to see all that compromises this condition of perfect love. In other words, you will see every manifestation of non-love, rejection, bitterness, condemnation, and contempt. You see and recognize, she hurt me and I bear her a grudge, but I still want to succeed in settling myself and dwelling in love. So I really like the way he's talking about it's a state that you're dwelling in and not a mental construct that you place upon your interactions with people.
Yeah, it's beautiful Dharma. It's tough, worthy of our effort and our practice.
He actually talks about how it's doable, which is very sweet. He's saying, you will succeed. He says, put your intention on this and you will succeed, which is very generous, I just found it very helpful. I was having a discussion with someone about evil people or people who do evil actions, and do we keep them in our vision of compassion? He says, of course, forgiveness and blessing will not keep us from trying to protect children from pedophiliacs, but always from a base of compassion.
Yeah.
The other thing I was going to say personally is, for me, it's keeping my heart open, not just in hell, but in joy and in all situations. I tend to be like, things are joyful, going well. What's going to go wrong here? I'm not going to keep my heart open. So sometimes when suffering is completely overwhelming, it's clear to me that I have to stay present. But for me, the challenge sometimes is staying present when I'm not having that overwhelming urgency to have to, when things are going well or something like that. Am I still staying present and open to the universe and to the divine?
Well, I really understand that. The kind of trust that is being asked from us to stay open in joy and in well-being and all of that, I think is just so important. We have things psychologically that can interfere with that, like trauma, for example, childhood trauma.
Yeah, I'm reminded of the wonderful story of Corrie ten Boom, who had been in one of the camps when she left the camp, and her father and sister and everybody had been killed. And she just made a decision that forgiveness had to happen because otherwise she would be destroyed internally. And when she was giving a talk in a church in Germany, and she saw at the back of the church the German officer who had been responsible for her father and her sister's death. And she knew she could not generate forgiveness in that case. And when he walked up to her, she felt an infusion of shock, the energy that went down from the top of her head out to her arm. And she reached out her arm to him. And she was absolutely convinced that this was God's grace, that there was no way that she was able to do that, but that the grace of God could create that happening. So as we're talking about the recognition of my inability to forgive or to love this situation, I can turn, as somebody who has a theistic religious orientation, I can say, I can't forgive, but let forgiveness be true through me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the way that you're languaging it, it shifts the whole context and makes it possible. When you were telling that story, I was remembering the story about this woman whose son was in a gang. And it was years ago that I heard this. Her son was in a gang and got killed by a rival gang member. And so she lost her only son. And they caught the man that shot her son. And he was going to trial, he had a lawyer, and she went to the trial. She sat through the whole trial. And when it was over, she said to him, I know that you killed my son, but I'm going to come and visit you every week in prison. And when you get out of prison, you can come and live in my house with me, and you can be my son. This was not someone that was on a spiritual path. It was someone that just was meeting the situation with profound compassion and forgiveness. And I'm sure that if we had another hour, we'd probably come up with even more stories. So thank you.
These really extreme situations are very inspiring and almost unbelievable. Then I relate that to my own situations in everyday life, and I have to make it very practical. I think the discussions like this that we have are really useful because then I have to bring it into my life. And I have to start in small ways. So I'm at Costco today, and I pull into a parking space, and the cars are really parked tightly together. I can barely get in. And I get out of my car, and some guy is yelling at me about how I haven't left him any room. And he's really on the verge of being violent. But then I recognize that violence has been triggered in myself as well. And I start getting ready to speak, and I say some things and catch myself, keeping my heart open in hell. Those words didn't occur to me, but something like that. And practicing with those kinds of small things is, I think, the foundation for some of the bigger things that happen, bigger things like the loss of someone. And I find that I have to find my own way through this. Words don't suffice. Loving what I do not love in such situations that are extreme, I don't know if there's a roadmap to that. I have to keep my heart open and be touched. What helps me are a couple considerations. One is to remember, because I believe this, that everything is bringing me to love, and all of us. I have faith in that. And it's just easy to forget that this thing that is so painful, really the universe is benevolent. Just to consider that idea, it's beyond what I can understand, but I have some faith in that. And then also, what happens is what I need. This is the last thing that I would want, but everyone is going to go through trials. And it's not just me. It kind of helps me a little bit to remember that and reorients my assemblage point, the way that I've looked at life. I have to get bigger. The process is making me bigger. And I have to decide if I want to go with that or not. And also what you have been referring to, that it's possible to be settled in love. I can't get there right now. I can do something, I think, to turn myself around, but I'm also going to have these feelings that I have. I can't pretend that I'm settled in love, but to have faith that it is possible to be settled in love is helpful to me.
I think part of the practice of being settled in love is to recognize when we're not and accept that as part of the process instead of being full of judgment for ourselves. I think that we have to be able to see all of it. So you said that you could feel violence within you arising as well. So was to keep your heart open in hell to not respond with violence? I'm not sure I understood what you meant.
Well, yes. I started walking toward him, and he was yelling at me, and he starts walking toward me. And at that moment, I realized that I was being a machine. What am I doing? I want to be bigger than this. And turned it around and said to him, hey, I'm going to back out. The spaces are so tight here, and that's the only way I could get in. And I'm going to back up and get right in between the lines. And this guy said, no, I'm going to back out. And he did. But it could go either way. To me, I'm not stable enough all the time to be able to do that. I recognize that in a moment, I could return violence with violence, not physically.
But the way that you cultivate that, the way you forge something in your own being is through examples exactly like you're talking about.
One last comment is that it's important for me to accept myself as I am.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not always the perfect practitioner.
I was walking into Sprouts, into the store, and I had parked my car. And I was just walking through the parking lot, and a man in a convertible as a passenger stood up in his car and started screaming profanities and insults, which I will not repeat in this talk, but very, very cruel, intense, demeaning comments to me to get out of the way and get out of the way immediately. And what was I doing in the first place, being in his way? Who did I think I was? And I didn't feel angry. I was terrified because I thought he was going to take out a gun. And it really caught me off guard because I was going to Sprouts. And what I did in that moment was I actually turned around and I looked right at him and I just said, I'm really sorry that I was in your way. Let me move over closer to the other cars. I'm sorry. I hope you can get through now. And he sat back down, and that was the end of it. So these things happen. And sometimes to keep one's heart open in volatile, potentially violent, difficult situations is just to get out of the way. Use that Aikido principle of just deflecting and getting out of the way. So again, like I'm saying, there are a lot of nuances of this practice. And yeah, sometimes we fail, sometimes we can't do it, and other times we can. And that's just the way that it is in all of life. I would like to end with reading a poem. This is a poem by Mary Oliver, and it's really an example of everything I've been talking about tonight and about saying yes to all of it with curiosity. It's a beautiful poem. I've read it many times and read it to you all. It's called When Death Comes. When death comes, like the hungry bear in autumn, when death comes and takes all the brightest coins from his purse to buy me and snaps the purse shut, when death comes like the measles pox, when death comes like an iceberg between the shoulder blades, I want to step through the door full of curiosity, wondering, what is it going to be like, that cottage of darkness? And therefore, I look upon everything as a brotherhood and a sisterhood. And I look upon time as no more than an idea. And I consider eternity as another possibility. And I think of each life as a flower, as common as a field daisy, and as singular. And each name a comfortable music in the mouth, tending as all music does towards silence. And each body a lion of courage and something precious to the earth. When it's over, I want to say all my life I was a bride married to amazement. I was the bridegroom taking the world into my arms. When it's over, I don't want to wonder if I have made of my life something particular and real. I don't want to find myself sighing and frightened or full of argument. I don't want to end up simply having visited this world.